Q&A. So, ball's in your court.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, it seems like there's a much higher emphasis put on the importance of prayer as far as sort of our servicing God, to God versus the physical mitzvot of Hesed and tzedakah and that kind of thing. But it seems like when you actually go out and you help people in person, like you get at least for me, I feel like you get a much deeper satisfaction of you actually to see them, the result of your labor versus with prayer. It's like yes, you're doing a service, but the results are sort of abstract. And it seems hard when when more emphasis be placed on the actual hard labor that is put into improving the world around us versus sort of the, some would say, archaic form of prayer.
I don't know how to measure emphasis, or measure investment. I think there are a couple of dangers here. First of all, you're talking about central planks in a whole lifestyle. To look at them as if they were isolated activities and stood on their own, I think is probably going to distort the meaning that they have. It's sort of like saying relative importance of diet and sport. Your diet affects your whole life. There's nothing that's independent. And your physical health affects your whole life. It affects your study, it affects your interpersonal relations, it affects your ability to earn money, it affects your happiness. So it isn't as if it's just two elements, and you say, well, how much money do I put into each, how much time do I put into each, because they have ripple effects. Now, one of the problems with, let's say, charity and interpersonal sensitivity and helping others is that many people would do that even if they were atheists. It's not obvious that when you do that, and the satisfaction you get from doing that has any inherent religious significance at all. Well, it's the Torah's view that if a person does an action and doesn't mean it to satisfy God's will, then he has not performed a mitzvah. He has not performed a mitzvah. That means an atheist can't do any mitzvahs at all. And it means a Jew who does something mindlessly or religiously mindlessly, he just does it because he reacts to it, and he gets satisfaction out of doing what he reacts to. It may not have any religious significance whatsoever. That means engaging in kindness and generosity and pursuing justice might actually detract from a person's religious identity and detract from his religious performance. There has to be a counterbalance to that. We're all aware of this when it comes to earning a living. You say, well, you get absorbed in making money and the economic competition, and you take credit for all the things that you do. We feel good about that remark because we tend to look down on making a living. I don't think that's right either. We tend to look down at it and say, well, that's all egotistical and it's all materialistic. What we forget is that any activity that has its own natural motivation, other than religious motivation, becomes either a caution or a danger to one's religious identity. Now, that's no reason not to help people, but it's reason to stress something that will be a counterbalance to that. If you see someone drowning and there's no one else to help, and you're not trained, but there's a boat or something, you decide you're going to go out to help. And you are told, which is absolutely true, that prayer is a way to help. Prayer is a way to help because God pays attention to prayer. Sometimes he does what you pray for, so you may actually save the person by praying for him. There's a natural attitude, okay, sure, prayer, but not if you could swim out and save him. Then swim out and save him. That remark overlooks the possibility of doing both. What about both? Why is it a choice? And why is the physical activity somehow so inherently superior that the prayer gets forgotten? I think that we need a constant consciousness raiser to realize that what we're doing is an expression of a religious identity. I don't think that comes naturally. And prayer, being at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, and also in the middle of the day, where you have to interrupt what you're doing in order to pray, is something which has that function. So it's not just prayer as a way to help people versus going to the hospital and visiting people, but prayer as a means of building one's religious identity, which then carries through everything that one does. I think that's one aspect of prayer that has to be taken into account. And prayer isn't just about helping other people, although you're right, the focus is on petition, and the petition is always in the plural. The petition is the name of the Jewish people as a whole. The Kuzari writes that prayer is for the soul what food is for the body. Now, when you finish breakfast, finish a nice, filling, satisfying, enjoyable breakfast, you know when lunch is coming. You know when lunch is coming. You know when your next meal is coming. If suddenly there's a disturbance in your program and you don't know what's coming, you want to know when lunch is coming. Are you not hungry now? But you're going to be hungry in 3 hours. Says the Kuzari, you ought to feel that way about prayer. Okay, just finish praying. When's the next prayer? Finish Shachris. When is Mincha going to be? Regular schedule? If not, where's it going to be? How am I going to do it? We don't feel that way about prayer. So it's something to invest in. I'm not answering your question really. What I'm saying is that it's a much broader context that has to be taken into account. And that context, has to be explored. It's a long effort. Yeah, what's next? Yeah.
There's a half clarifying a point and half asking a question. Through asking you questions over some time, I've sort of forgotten certain positions, and I just want to clarify a certain position. Allegorizing the Torah, that's something we try and move away from, to say the least. Specifically, Adam and Chava, the flood. Now, is the position why we openly say there's no need for us even to consider allegorization is because we believe those sort of events happened in I suppose putting it simply, a miraculous way, which means they're not open to scientific inquiry, in which case we have the Messiah, and we have what the backwards extrapolation of science is today. And as they're not talking the same language, it's not even a discussion. Is that your view on the subject?
No, it's not my view, and it's not a correct view. The reason we don't allegorize is because the Torah specifically says that Moses' prophecy was not allegory. The Torah itself says it in those words. Rabbi Meisman, in his book, has about 5 chapters on this, going through the idea of allegorization in Rav Saadia Gaon, in the Rambam, in the Rashba, and they are all dead against allegorizing the Torah. As against prophets who spoke in allegories all the time, they are dead against speaking in Ba'aloscha, where Kosh Baruch Hu criticizes Aaron and Miriam for speaking against Moses. One of the things he says there is, I don't speak to Moses in riddles. I don't speak to him in allegories. I speak to him in clear visions and in straightforward language. Now, in order to understand this point, you must appreciate the difference between allegory and metaphor. Something else Rabbi Meisman writes about, which is a crucial distinction. In metaphor, words are not used literally. Words are not used literally. They're used to communicate, and what they communicate is true, but the words are not used literally. So, for example, it says the cities of Canaan are fortified to the heavens. Well, they aren't fortified to the heavens. That's obvious, and the Talmud says so. The Talmud saying so is more important than it's being obvious. That's more important. But the Talmud says so. It's a guzma. It's an exaggeration. So the fortified to the heavens, the words as used there in the Torah don't literally mean fortified to the heavens. They either mean when you look at them, you're so overwhelmed by their might, you feel crushed as if they were fortified to the heavens, or something else like that. But it's not literally true. Okay? That's a metaphor. The sky was ink. No, the sky was not ink, but it presented the appearance of ink in certain respects. That's a metaphor. What's an allegory? In an allegory, all the words are used in strictly literal sense. All the words are used in strictly literal sense to tell a story, and the story is false. The story is a false story. Aesop's fables. The fox saw the grapes, and he couldn't get it into the garden because the crack in the fence was too small. So he starved himself till he became very thin, and he squeezed himself to the fat, the crack, and then he ate the grapes, became so fat he couldn't get out, and then he had to starve himself to be able to get out. When he got out, he was just as starved as he was before he went in. In that story, fox means fox, and grapes means grapes, and crack means crack, but it's not a true story. It never happened to a fox. By telling this false story with literal words, I'm telling a false story, I mean to communicate some message, some idea, some principles, some teaching of some kind. The prophets write in allegories. Rabbi talks about the end of days when the skies will be ablaze and the mountains will fall down and so forth and so on, as describing ultimately political upheaval or political change. The words say the mountains will fall. That's what the words say. Mountain means mountain and fall means fall. But it's not describing something real. The story is meant to indicate something else. There's no allegory in the Torah. There's no allegory in the Torah. Allegory would mean the story of Adam and Eve is the story of a man and a woman in a garden and a snake and so forth and so on, and it never happened. Never happened. It means to teach you about reason and emotion, or it means to teach you about the forces of nature, or it means to teach you about the dangers of inappropriate social organization or something else, right? That's an allegory. An allegory is where the words are used literally, and it tells a story, and the story never happened. And by telling you a false story, I mean to teach you a lesson. That does not take place in the Torah. Does not take place. Whereas on occasion, words are used in metaphorical sense, but then that's a different sense that the word has, and what the word describes is literally true. There's no point in the Torah where it tells you a story, and you can say later, the story wasn't the story that happened, just meant to teach you something. That's what's wrong. What's wrong with allegorizing is that the Torah says that Moses didn't get allegories, and the Rosh Hashanah and the Rambam and the Rashba all say literally there's no allegory in the Torah. That's what's wrong with it. And what's wrong with it is not an external inference from science yes and science no or anything else. It is a direct, literal part of the Masorah. But that's not an acceptable move.
And the scientific thing, or the scientific relation that I just mentioned comes afterwards.
That comes afterwards. That comes afterwards as a separate thing. The external critic will say, well, if there are really stories of things that happen, how could that be scientifically? Okay, good, it's a question. And we have answers for it. And there are some cases where we don't have answers, then we don't have answers. So what? The Rashba once writes in a tshuva, it's a long tshuva, I'm not going to summarize the whole thing, but he says, you deal with these questions in a reasonable way, and you try to find a solution. And if you don't find a solution, then what you say is, it's a real contradiction. Don't blink. Don't pretend it isn't. Understand and assert that it is a real contradiction. And the Torah is right, and I don't know why.
Why bother trying to reconcile it?
Because you learn something about the Torah that way. Sometimes the Torah has alternate interpretations, and the conflict with science may stimulate you to search for the alternate interpretations. I'll give you an example which it's in the Rishonim, and I guess I knew it, but I can't. This time through in the Daf Yomi, it just hit me. I mean, Rabbi Meisner has it in the book, but it still didn't make enough of an impression on me. The Gemara says, when a woman and man get married, what style of life can she expect when she gets married? So the answer is there are two styles that are relevant to her: the style she was used to in her father's house, and the style that's customary in her husband's family. And the rule is she gets the better of the two. She goes up with the husband, it does not go down with the husband. So if her father's style of life was higher, the husband has to provide her with the higher style of life. And if the husband's family's style of life was higher, then she goes up to his style of life. That's the rule. Now where do we learn this from? One of the verses we learn this from is where Chava is described with Hi Isa Aim Kol Chai. She is the mother of all life. So the Gemara says, life, she is given to you for life, for happiness, and not for pain, not for suffering. That's what the Gemara says. I looked at that and I said, golly, it's just a statement that she was the mother of all life. How did they get to drag this idea out of these words? Until it hit me. The statement that's written there is false. It's false. She's the mother of all life. Can you think of a crashing exception to that? Adam! She wasn't Adam's mother! Isn't that terrible? She wasn't Adam's mother. Okay, all life means humans, right? But she wasn't Adam's mother. So the verse must be communicating something, at least in addition, because it says she was the mother of all life. That's not true. It's not true. Right there in that verse, it's not true. So then it means, like you treat your mother with respect. So you have to treat her as if she were your mother, and life means life and not pain. But there, you're forced to say something because it's not true on the basis of the text itself. The text itself says she wasn't Adam's mother. So it makes sense out of the text as a whole. You have to say something like that. And realize that's usual. Chazal are not playing. They're not playing. They're not trivial. They're not soft-headed. Everything is based on some kind of logic. So there's where once you realize you're facing something like that, and you say, well, then I haven't understood the message of the Torah. At least not the complete message. There's more to the message than that. But when science forces you to look again at the text, then you're under a terrible challenge. Not to let the scientific challenge influence your interpretation of the text. The interpretation of the text is based on internal rules and internal methodology. It just may force you to look again to see whether you missed some internal option. But the idea that I simply ignore the text or interpret it fancifully so as to make it reconciled with evolution and the rest of the modern nonsense, that's terrible. And there can be debates. There can be debates among the Talmudic sages and the later sages. What kinds of reinterpretations are appropriate? Rav and Abaye in the Gemara very often disagree about how much reinterpretation of a Tannaitic text is appropriate. Abaye is more liberal in interpreting, and Rav often says, but it doesn't say that. And since it doesn't say that, I don't accept it, and he looks for another way to reconcile the text. So this is a matter of sensitivity, and it's a matter of deep and broad scholarship. Yeah.
Schools.
Rabbi Heinemann in Baltimore many years ago said, a skula is something that could help.
Okay, that's
It's something that could help. Let's understand. What would you say about surgery? Surgery doesn't always help.
Yes.
I had a fellow whom I knew who was a surgeon. He told me every surgeon has killed patients. Every surgeon has killed patients. Surgeons make mistakes. And if you do enough surgeries, you're going to kill people. So, what shall I say? Surgery definitely helps, has to help. Surgery could help. I mean, school and schools could help. Now, I'll tell you something else that happened about 8 years ago. And this was really very interesting. Here I'm going to quote a contemporary Christian philosopher who I think had the right thing. There was a hospital in Korea, a fertility hospital. And they set up a blind trial of praying for these people. And they took people around the world. Each patient was given a number, and they took people to pray. And they had patients who were in parallel situations. Some were prayed for and some were not. And the ones who were prayed for had better rates of success. And this was run by a professor in the Columbia Medical School. I mean, it was a pretty reputable job. Oh, this went around on the internet and all sorts of things were, And with that kind of reputable investigator and this kind of result, you have evidence that prayer works. Fine. They tried 3 or 4 times to replicate the results, and it was unsuccessful. Now, there are chance correlations. The reason you do replicatory studies, and not enough of them are done, is to see whether it was a chance correlation or whether it was a robust and survives, changes of variables. And it didn't. So the incautious, overeager atheist said, so you see that prayer doesn't work. No, but that's a mistake. It might be, as Richard Swinburne of Oxford pointed out.
And it was one of 3 philosophers you were going to quote.
Yeah.
It was either him, John Lennox, or Alan Plantinga.
I don't quote John Lennox.
Really? He's a mathematician.
I know he's a mathematician, but I've read his stuff about religion. That's his problem.
Alan Plantinga's good, though.
Alan Plantinga is excellent. Excellent. John Lennox is a mathematician, and like many people, he's writing outside his field. And once you step outside your field, you lose your credibility. And his stuff is not really up to par. Nice that he's trying to do the right thing, but he's not up to par. I would not use him. But Alan Plantinga is first rate. He's a first-rate philosopher in not only in religious philosophy, but in general philosophy as well. He wrote very fundamental books. Anyway, back to work. So Plantinga said, maybe prayer works when you're not looking. Maybe God doesn't want you to have statistical evidence that prayer works. You can't show that prayer doesn't work by a statistical study. You can only show that some natural blind phenomenon doesn't work by a statistical study. But here you're trying to track the behavior of an intelligent agent. So a negative result does not imply that it doesn't work. Indeed, he said, what kind of prayers were these for these women in Korea? They were blind prayers. The people that were praying didn't know the people they're praying for. They knew they were taking part in a study. Is that really prayer? We really care whether the person gets better or not? So I think that was a very profound point. If it comes out statistically that there is a correlation, then that would be strong positive evidence that prayer helps. But the negative way doesn't work. If you don't think that's fair, too bad.
I was going to say, you're saying it's not open. All things of the metaphysical nature of this, they're just simply not open to investigation.
No. Oh, you can do better than that. I just said I just said you can get positive evidence. I just said you can get positive evidence.
You won't know if it's positive evidence.
Sure you will. Why not?
Because when it's negative evidence, you don't accept it.
That's just what I said. Just what I shouted down. That's just what I shouted down. That's a prejudice. That's just a prejudice. That's just a prejudice. That's just a prejudice. You don't have to have parity between the availability of positive evidence and the availability of negative evidence. You don't have to have parity. It doesn't follow that either you have both or you have neither. That's simply incorrect. I'll give you an example that doesn't have to do with God, so the feelings will be under control, all right? The hypothesis is there's industrial espionage going on. Some external agent is tinkering with our computers to make them work less than perfect, so as to lower our competitive capacity. Okay? What kind of negative evidence would rule that out? It only happens on Thursdays? It happened only in red graphs and not blue graphs? The intelligent agent might think up ways to cover his tracks. No matter how much negative evidence you have, it might be just a very clever negative agent. You had this in wartime, a counter spy. How do you know who he's working for, the counter spy? He's got to have credibility on both sides. I led 3 lives, the guy in England who sold out to the communists. He was high up in the counter spy. He was a counter spy. All right? You have to have credibility on both sides and somehow give more advantage to one side without the other side knowing it. Right? You can be in a situation, are they sabotaging our computers or are computers breakdowns within the norm? You can have a situation where the guy doing the sabotage is very clever, but you could have positive evidence. You could find him. You could set a trap and find him. You could intercept his transmissions. It's simply not true that you must have a parity between negative evidence and positive evidence. When you're dealing with an intelligent agent, he can cover his tracks. If you have a positive correlation between prayer and recovery, that can't be a fluke. If you do it right, if you do a double-blind experiment, if you reproduce it in different places, and so on, that's going to be positive evidence for correlation. But you can't have evidence of no correlation when you're dealing with an intelligent agent, because the intelligent agent can cover his tracks so that you don't find the correlation.
Okay.
But you see, I was speaking to you. Before you said it, I was already speaking to you. There's a deep-seated prejudice. Aye. Yeah, next. What's on people's minds? Yeah, go ahead.
It's an interesting one. The idea of bitachon, and there are many different, there's what it means, there's where it's interpreted by the sources, but some people can use it in a flawed way, meaning that simply having faith that God will provide for you means God will, by definition, provide for you. Meaning, it's a cause in and of itself, rather than, it's on the subject you mentioned earlier about people having a negative view towards work. If I have faith in God, I don't have to work. The question arises, if you then provide that person with money, you're reinforcing that belief, because it's working. and getting money. And so if you're going to give money to someone without them knowing you're the one giving it to them, all they will see is them receiving money, in which case you're reinforcing this. I want to call it a delusion, but I think there are probably some big people who say it's the case. I don't know too much about it. But what do you do in a situation like that? Is there credit to this person's point of view? Maybe I am giving it because they had dirt. I mean...
Okay, I think you appreciate a good part of the problem. First of all, let me just get the philosophical background on the table. There is an idea that if you really trust God, if you really believe it, it will happen. There is such an idea. It is for 0.000000001% of the population. And anybody that you know who adopts this point of view is irresponsible and wrong. No question about that. But it's not a completely foreign idea. It's not a completely... Rav Dessler has a famous essay on, you're talking about Shtadlus, trust and endeavor. He divides people into 5 categories. And there are people who can command miracles. Who can command miracles. And you'll tell me, the Gemara says, ain't something on the nation, not rely on miracles. Not everybody. Not everybody. There are exceptions to that. Okay, that's used by certain people. They put on the back of cars. Thank you very much.
But now I was talking about the advice in the Gemara about the witch when he...
Okay. Yes. And you have people, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, the Gemara tells 2 famous stories about Hanina ben Dosa. One is that in his vicinity there was a road. A road is some kind of poisonous creature, very poisonous, whether it's some kind of spider or some kind of reptile. And it's endangered people, so Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said, show me where he lives. And he lived in a hole in the ground. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa took off his sandal and put his heel on the hole. And the erode bit him, and the erode died. And Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said, from this you see, it is sin that kills, and not the erode. So the Gemara says they carried him, picked him on his shoulders and carried him back to the shul and celebrated him. I'm not recommending that you stick your heel in the hole of a poisonous creature. And the other was his daughter was filling the lamps for Shabbos, and by accident she put vinegar in the lamps instead of oil, and she actually brought fire and ignited the wicks. And then she said, "Oh my God, it's vinegar, it's not oil." And he said, "He who commanded oil to burn will command vinegar to burn." And the vinegar burned the whole Shabbos. Now, Rodessa says, the appearance of nature hides God's presence. The goal, this is based on Ramchal and other sources, and the goal is to penetrate that false appearance, to penetrate that veil behind which God hides. That's the goal. The appearance of nature is kept up just so long as that is the goal. But for a person who's penetrated the veil, he sees God's presence universally, then the veil is not necessary anymore. For him, nature's not relevant anymore. And he can command miracles as he pleases without any difficulty. Great people didn't do that, and he has an explanation of why they typically didn't do that, but they could. So there is such an idea that there is nothing but God, or I trust, or whatever it is, where it can be the cause of the salvation in that way. It can happen. But what does it mean to penetrate the veil? And here, Rav Dessler is explicit, and as is usually the case, Rav Dessler is very subtle. But it's like Rashi. You can read through and just think it was afternoon musings. You pay careful attention to his vocabulary. And if you ask yourself objections against him, and then think again about what he wrote, you see that he has very subtle ideas to provide. Penetrating the veil for Rav Dessler is an emotional state, not an intellectual state. It's an emotional state. It's very easy to learn the mantra, God is running everything. No, there's no such thing as nature. God is providing everything. Okay, if you give me a philosophy exam, who's running the world, nature or God? God, right. Check that one off. Next one. That's not what is meant. What's meant is you experience it the same. You experience it the same. So when the vinegar burns, your pulse rate doesn't go up. Your respiration doesn't go up. You're not filled with glory and inspiration any more than when the oil is burning, because it's all God. That's what it means to penetrate it. It means to penetrate it experientially. When he puts his heel on the hole where the arod lives, he's not praying, please save me. It makes no difference whether there's a road there, or a mouse there, or nothing there. It makes no difference. That's a very, very exalted condition to get to, where you experience God's presence, not to just intellectually know it, because you've taught the right answers to the philosophy questions. That's going to be extremely, extremely rare. Such a person can... Now, what about the person who falsely takes that upon himself and says, there's a story about the Alshich, where he was giving a shir, a lesson to his Talmidim about trusting God. He's a great, great scholar, a great preacher, a very holy person. His students were on very high level. The shoemaker, one of the artisans, happened to come in towards the end of the shir. He heard him saying, if you trust in God, then God will provide for you. Fine. So the shoemaker decided they're going to try it. And the students decided they're going to try it. 30 days. 29 days, nothing happens. The night of the 29th, a robber in the local area who had just finished a robbery, he tied the sacks of gold to his donkey, and the donkey was tied to a tree, and the donkey chewed through the tether of the rope and wandered into the shoemaker's house, and there he is with 2 sacks of gold. And the students got nothing. The great students of the great master got nothing. And they were very disappointed. And they went to Alshich and said, what happened? And he said, what were you thinking about for the 29 days? Thinking, well, I'm not doing anything. I'm not providing anything, and we're using up our supplies. I wonder how God's going to do it. What if things are available, and so forth and so on. He called in the shoemaker and said, what have you been thinking about the last 29 days? Thinking? I was reciting Psalms. I wasn't thinking about anything. You said it would come, so it'll come. Right? So, it's going to be a very, very special person who gets to that level. Now, a person who doesn't get to that level, so then how to deal with him, that depends upon psychology. But just giving him money, I think you're right. Just giving him money is going to reinforce this false attitude. And that I agree with you, I think it can be dangerous. The Chovos Levavos has a beautiful argument on this issue, which if you're dealing with a person who's rational at all, and he may not be, but if you're dealing with a person rational, you might try this out on him. The Chovos Levavos says, you're hungry. Now somebody comes into your house and presents a cooked steak. He cuts off a piece, puts it on a fork, and puts it in your mouth. Are you prepared to chew and swallow it? Is that an acceptable activity? Something you think that's appropriate for you to do? Most people will say yes. You say, okay, well, what if he puts it on a table without cutting it? Will you take a knife and fork, cut off a piece, put it in your mouth, chew and swallow? Sure, why not? Suppose he brings it in raw. Will you cook it, cut off a piece, put it in your mouth, chew and swallow? Okay, it's raw, it's raw. Suppose he gives you money. Will you take the money, go to the store, buy the meat, bring it home, cook it, cut off a piece, put it in your mouth, chew and swallow? I guess so. Suppose he offers you a job to earn the money. No! Job, money, work. I don't have to do that. God will provide. Well, God can keep you alive if you don't eat also. Where'd you draw the line? How'd you decide where to draw the line? You don't have to eat. It's not beyond God's ability to keep you alive if you don't eat. No. Eat, yes. Cook the steak, yes. Use the money to buy the steak, to cook the steak, to eat the steak, yes. But work, no. There's absolutely no source whatsoever for drawing the line at work. That's the normal attitude. The Torah says, "Uverach es ma'aseh yedecha." God will bless the works of your hands. That's for the 99.999999999%. The Gemara codifies this. Gemara in Brachos. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shmuel said, "You want to." I'm reading through Rashi now. I heard this from Rabbi Shaleski, who taught it and explained us the appropriate hashkafa behind it. You want to maximize your Torah learning, says Rabbi Shmuel, be a responsible farmer. Plant at the time of planting, and harvest at the time of harvesting, and grind and bake. That's how you'll maximize your Torah learning. Because you'll have an organized life. You'll have a regular life. You'll know where your food and your livelihood are coming from, and you'll be able to set aside the extra time to learn. If you're not doing that, you're borrowing and begging and doing things by chance and taking opportunities, you'll have a disorganized life and you'll have less learning. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai agree that your job is to maximize learning. Rabbi Shmuel says the way to maximize learning is to have a reasonable way to earn your living and learn in the rest of the time. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, if you're going to plant at the time of planting, if you're going to harvest at the time of harvesting, and all the rest, what's going to happen to the Torah? Rather, you sit and learn, and God will take care of you. Now on that, the Gemara says, many attempted the strategy of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and failed. Many attempted the strategy of Rabbi Shmuel and succeeded. Failed and succeeded means in maximizing Torah learning. Not in making money, but in maximizing Torah learning. Which means that for the vast, vast majority of people, having a reasonable job and having an organized life and set aside regular times to study is the way to maximize your Torah learning. And only for those exalted few, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, where they can expect miracles to take place, yes, for them, the appropriate thing to do is what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did. You want to see a wonderful essay, Rav Dessa's essay is a wonderful essay, but it's now translated even into English. Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, the Rambam's son, wrote a book, Hamaspik L'Ovdei Hashem. It's written in Arabic. The Hebrew means something like what's sufficient to be able to serve God. It's essays on various subjects, and it's a long essay on trust in God and endeavor.
There's a subcategory of cause and effect.
And it's an amazing, amazing essay. It's very, very worthwhile. Very worthwhile. So those are two sources we found.
Doesn't the story of the Alshach go against what you're saying? Meaning, and if it's a true story, if it's said as a true story, then, well, if a simple shoemaker can do it, then why can't I do it?
Because it's a spiritual quality, and your intellectual superiority may cripple your spiritual quality.
So anybody who thinks they're doing it the right way, by definition, they're trying to do it in an intellectual way?
Not necessarily. I don't think you can have any hard, fast rules on this subject. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's very easy to fool yourself. The sophisticated disciples of the Alshach all fooled themselves into thinking they were doing it. So it's very easy to fool yourself. And this, like anything else in religious or spiritual terms, you have to have a certification of somebody big. If somebody big says to you, yes, you're fit for this, you're worthy of this, then these things are very subtle. Rav Yaakov Hillel wrote a wonderful book. In Hebrew it's called Tomim Tihya, in English it's called Faith and Folly. The approbations he has writing this book are more and more impressive than I've seen in any other book. He was asked to write it because of a great deal of false superstition among believing Jews of a certain sector, and he has a lot of credibility in that sector. And both Ashkenazi and Sephardi leaders of the generation asked him to write it. And I published it many years ago, and it's really a gem. But one of the stories that he tells in there is of a man who was traveling home from some trip or other, coming through the forest, leading to his town, and an old man suddenly appeared and said to him, "Here, I have this for you." He gives him a bag of gold. Okay? Comes home and he comes to his Rebbe and tells him the story, and the Rebbe says, that gold comes from the wrong side. Go back to the forest and yell and scream until he makes an appearance and tell him that I told you, you have to give it back. Goes back to the forest, he yells and screams, the old man appears. He says, my Rebbe told me that it comes from the wrong side, I can't keep it, I have to give it back. So the old man said, fine. And he took the bag of gold and said, go tell your Rebbe that all his powers come from the same place. All his powers come from the same place. So he goes back and he says to his Rebbe, the old man had a message that all your powers come from the same place. So he said, if so, then I'm not a Rebbe. And he walked out of it. It means he himself didn't know where his powers were coming from. He himself didn't know that they were illicit powers. We're talking about very tricky business here. Very, very tricky business. And that's why the only thing you can trust is if you go to somebody big, who's known to be a leader, So then, if he certifies it, at the very least, here's a principle just worth noting. The principles of responsibility in Torah terms are very, very similar to normal intuitive principles of responsibility. There are no chidushim, no unique qualities of responsibility. What you want when you do something is to be able to defend yourself later. Why did you do it that way? Why didn't you do it some other way? If I can say, I went to one of the world's experts, and he told me X, what else do you want me to do? What should I have done? Gone to a different expert? Why? If I went to that expert, you could have asked me, I went to him rather than this one. What did you want me to do? I did all that I can do. I'm not an expert, so I went to an expert. That's good in medicine, it's good in auto repair, it's good in mathematics, but it's good in Torah also. But to make the conclusion on your own, that's something else. Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's two sons, died. The Talmud has a list of the types of crimes that they committed. One of it is they rendered a legal decision in the presence of their teacher, Moses, without asking him and saying, we have an opinion that this and this should be done. What is the truth? If there's a superior opinion available, then of course you have to go and take counsel with a superior opinion. So if there are questions like this, in personal terms, you have to go to somebody who's a big person and ask for help. Someone went to Kanievsky. I mean, let's just show you little things. Chaim Kanievsky, this happened about 5 years ago. It's a 30-year-old boy who's been trying to get married for who knows how long, maybe 8 years, and having no success. Goes to Chaim Kanievsky and he says, your kala, your bride, isn't born yet. Your bride isn't born yet. Can you imagine walking out, hearing that? 3 months later, he was engaged to a convert. A woman who converted. The Gemara's description of conversion is like a newborn person. She wasn't born yet. She hadn't converted yet. So even there, you don't know what he means. But then later, it turns out. Anyway, okay, what's next?
So you're saying to ask your superiors or your rabbis where to draw the line on how much to work.
Exactly. That's exactly what Dessler, in this essay, makes it dependent upon the individual psychology. It's going to vary from person to person and also for different periods of your life. And it's based on a certain subtle test of this attitude or experience of the world, as I said before. And self-testing is, of course, fraught with prejudice. You're not objective in your own case. So these are the kinds of decisions that you take together with an advisor.
Versus just going to the highest authority or sticking with the rabbi that you know?
So it's a combination. Usually, the rabbi that you know, if he's a good candidate, will have learned from somebody higher up the level. So see, what you have is a trickle-down effect from higher up the ladder. Everybody has to be connected. As one rabbi in America said to me, the Mishnah Pirkei Avos says, "Aseh lecha rav." Make for yourself a teacher. Okay? Does that Mishnah apply to everybody? Or are there exceptions? Left-handed people, blue-eyed people don't have to do it. No, applies to everybody. That automatically, immediately makes a chain to the top. Okay, so he's teaching me. Who taught him? And who taught his teacher? Everybody has to find himself a teacher. Now, there may be people at the top of the chain who know it more than some say. Maimonides says. Maimonides, in his commentary in the Mishnah says, if you're at the top of the chain, go learn from an inferior. Go learn from an inferior. Because in the process of teaching and listening and then responding, the learning is improved. Even if you're hearing lectures from an inferior. Everyone has to have a mission. And this is Maimonides talking, right? The philosopher. It's an amazing state. Yeah, so you have to go to somebody and you assume there's a trickle-down effect. Now, if the person who's your regular contact is a responsible person, from time to time he'll say, this is too big for me. This my Rabbi said that for me a number of times. It's just too big for me, and he sent me to people who were world authorities because it was a tricky and subtle issue. There are people who are specialists. My Rabbi told me 45 years ago, the age of specialization. I saw a book on ribis, the prohibition against taking interest in monetary transactions. A book on ribis this thick, with all sorts of equations and legal contracts and delays. The government says this, and the Torah says that. It's endless. This guy is a world expert on interest. if there are simple questions of interest, and some that are not so simple. So he stays rest for questions of interest.
I guess as a new student, it seems hard to reconcile where it seems like a somewhat of a contradiction within Judaism, where like you mentioned a couple of times so far, but also like in the Kuzari, it also goes into a depth where you can't figure out faith purely on intellect, but Judaism is a particular faith where we have so much intellectual pursuit, studying Talmud and Torah, and it's you're using logic and reasoning and language skills, and it's how do you reconcile that where it's like it emphasizes so much intellect, but at the same time requires a huge amount of experience and kind of the emotional aspect of it.
Oh, I thought you were asking a different question. No, okay. There's another question in your words, which is a very important question, but I'll adjust what you said. Let's take a slice of it. What's the status of intuition? Intuition. People think of intuition against logic. Should I trust my intuition? The answer is very simple. Intuition is tested the way anything else is tested. It's tested by results. God, it seems to me that Q. Should I trust my intuition that Q? Ask yourself, how many times in the past when you've had similar intuitions have you been right? And how many times in the past with similar intuitions have you been wrong? And if you get it right 92% of the time, trust it, go with it, definitely. 92%, that's better than surgery. If it's 50-50 or 40-60, because there could be several alternatives, then you don't trust it. Intuition, emotion are ways of dealing with the world. And they can be more accurate or less accurate. The only way you can know is there are people who read other people's intuitions, read other people's emotions. They look at the person and say he's depressed. Other people say, I know he's depressed or anxious or worried or happy, or I just know he's excited. That's all. He's got a high respiration rate. So I know something's going on. So some people are good at reading it, some people aren't. They can't tell you how they read it. They haven't got a secret book in a safe telling you this many blinks per minute and that many crinkles in the brow and so forth and so on. They just learn from experience that they're good at this. So emotion can be a very good guide to what's going on or a very terrible guide to what's going on. It's going to vary from person to person. It may vary from different periods of life. And the only way you can know is use your experience to tell you whether it's a good guide or isn't a good guide. That means it's all logic. When you're talking about logic versus emotion, logic trumps everything, but logic can certify emotion also. People say, I have a hunch that this is the way to do it. Chess masters. The number of different possible chess positions, even reasonable ones, is beyond computing. It's just so they develop a certain feel. And they say, well, the left side is too weak. Well, how weak is too weak? And how do I know, when it's weak enough? And how much do I have to do to collect it? When it'll be strong enough, then it'll be okay. But he wins the games. He wins the games. Mathematicians who prove theorems, there's no mechanical method for proving theorems. That was Gödel's theorem, Turing's theorem. All right? But certain people regularly come up with new mathematical proofs, and the rest of us try to read their proofs. But we don't come up with them because they have an insight. Not an insight they can put into words, but experience proves that they get new mathematical proofs that we don't. So there are all sorts of ways of dealing with the world based on capacities that we don't understand very well. It's the rate of success that leads you to trust them or not to trust them. In that respect, I say it all comes under the rubric of logic, because logic in this sense becomes a regulator of other capacities. It doesn't exclude, it's not in place of or in competition with them. It's a regulator of those other capacities. Okay? I thought you were going to ask about faith. You started with that. Logic as opposed to faith, accepting things without reason. Faith, F-A-I-T-H, is a Christian word. It has no use in the Jewish religion, period. Those who have used it in translations of Hebrew words, translations all have weaknesses and inaccuracies. Where your English translator writes faith, I would substitute rational trust. Trust means I can't verify it on my own. So I'm trusting somebody else. But I can have reason to trust him, like my doctor. I can't verify that this is the right pill for me. I've got a clue what it is. I've got a clue what's wrong with me. I don't want to have a clue. I don't want to do medicine. I want to do philosophy. I'm not interested in that. I pay him to do that. But he has a degree. He's certified. He's in good practice. He's been my doctor for 30 years. He's helped me through thick and thin. So I have rational trust. The word faith, certainly in Christian and post-Christian, the word faith means belief without reason. There's no place for that in Judaism. There's no place for belief without reason. But the reason may be the reason I have to trust a source. That's also reason. It's reasonable to trust my doctor. It may be reasonable to trust certain Jewish sources as well. So that means, if you want to call that faith, misusing the word, you want to call it because I can't verify it myself, but it is not against reason. Whereas faith, as it's used in common parlance, is against reason. Relying on faith means I don't have good reason. The French, as is customary for the French, artfully slur the contrast. They have a wonderful phrase in French, "La cour a ses raisons." The heart has its reasons. But of course, if it's the heart and it's not the brain, then it's not reasons. You call it reasons so as to pretend that you have reasons, but you don't really have reasons. You're abandoning reason. That's not the Jewish approach.